I'm Dr. Keith Bramwell, Director of Hatchery Consultancy with Jamesway Incubator Company, and welcome to our webinar Wednesday series. Have a lot of great topics we've covered over the years, and you can find all of them at the Jamesway homepage, and have a YouTube channel as well that has 80 some odd past webinars, presentations of some different topics as well. So curious about anything, look there. We've got a lot of good answers there. A little bit of housekeeping about the webinar today. So it will be in Spanish as well, and I'll have that explained to you a little bit in Spanish. But the other thing is, on the bottom of your page, there's a Q&A box at any time during the presentation. If you have a question, go ahead and type it in there, and we will address all the questions, or as many as we can, after the presentation. Have a discussion about that, so don't worry about that. Also, everybody will get an email that has a link to this presentation and ability to download the PDF. So we get asked that all the time, can I get a copy of this? Yes, everybody will have a copy of it. You'll get an email in the next day or two on that. So for simultaneous translation, there's a button down the bottom that says interpretation, and I'm going to let Carolina explain that real quick. Go ahead, Carolina. Are you there? Okay.
Gracias, Kit. Bueno, para todas las personas de habla español, queremos recordarles que en la parte de abajo tenemos una casilla de Q y A, la cual corresponde a preguntas y respuestas, las cuales serán respondidas al final de la presentación, y pueden oprimir el globo en la parte inferior para traducción simultánea en español.
Thank you. So again, if you want to listen to it in Spanish, hit the interpretation button at the bottom and you'll be able to do that. So today our speaker is Dr. Shawna Weimer. She is the chair and director of the Center for Food and Animal Wellbeing at the University of Arkansas as part of the Division of Agriculture. So she works in food science and poultry science, animal science. So she's got a big group that she works with there in Arkansas. She did finish her PhD at University of Arkansas in this exact field. Comes from Iowa, I believe, where she did a lot of her undergrad work. And then she's had a couple of stops after that before she at other universities before she settled back at Arkansas. So she's going to be talking about animal welfare issues, and I look forward to her discussion today. So with that, Shawna, Dr. Weimer, would you go ahead, share your screen, and we'll proceed.
All right. Is my screen shared?
Yes.
Okay. So we're good to go? All right. Yep. Thank you very much. So thank you very much for having me today. It's a pleasure to be here with, I don't know if I want to say old friend, but with Keith and with Jamesway. And I look forward to the Q&A session afterwards. So as Dr. Bramwell mentioned, I'm Shawna Weimer. I'm an assistant professor and the director of the Center for Food and Animal Wellbeing at the University of Arkansas. And today I'm going to be talking about balancing chick welfare and production efficiency, really with a focus on how we got to where we are today in terms of animal welfare, really with a big focus on the U.S. history. So taking several steps back, over a century back, this is sort of what was seen in the U.S. when we were fairly new and developing. So you can see that animals were raised outside. You can see some chickens with some sheds there in a pasture system. And then I really like to talk about the Boston Children's Hospital in 1914, where they had dairy cows in a field across the way. And I forget exactly what they used their milk for, but the cows were there, I think, for vaccines for the Children's Hospital. So literally, the Children's Hospital is still there, but the cows are not. So this is what someone in society, in a city, a century ago would see, and it certainly has changed. So going forth several years, people didn't want to see animals in their cities. There was sanitation issues, and industrialization really started to boom. So animals started moving outside of the cities, and they began to grow in numbers in a smaller space. So that's really due to technology and the industry. So there were a lot of benefits for this. In very extensive systems, there were a few animals in a large area that took a lot more resources to manage those animals. So by condensing animals into cages, in the case of laying hens, and feedlots for cattle and stalls for sows, the management was a lot easier on the human side to maintain health. So there was an increase in hygiene, disease was lowered, mortality rates went way down, smaller groups, so there was less social stress in the terms of laying hens, a lot easier to administer medications and treat individuals that were ill. And of course, just generally easier. People aren't outside in the harsh elements, so being inside was easier for the animals in a temperature and ventilation controlled environment as with the humans. And so it was good for the animals and the humans. And really, this is what promoted the sustainability of animal agriculture. Agriculture in general, tractors came around at this time too, that are now pretty much self-driving, right? But in terms of animals, all of this history led to increased food security, so people could afford animal protein, and it boosted the economy and the sustainability of the industry. So moving even further, really integration, especially for poultry, happened. We have complexes now where there's the feed mill and the processing plant and the hatchery generally in a similar area for a complex, and then the farms that support that around it. So in the case of dairy cows, there's no longer a farmer with a bucket milking the cow. There's automated milkers. And then we started putting, this is an old broiler pole barn, but building bigger facilities with more animals. But also around this time, around the 1960s and 70s, is when animal rights started to come into modern society in the US and in the United Kingdom. So this is sort of a comparison of the UK versus the US. And in 1964, Ruth Harrison published the book Animal Machines, and that's when the term factory farm came about. You'll see that a lot on media sites. So their factory farm was coined. So what people actually wanted, which was for animals to be away from cities and for affordable food. Now it has this term doom and gloom of factory farm. So really the book focused on confinement. So cages for laying hens, crates for sows, and veal crates. So confinement and invasive practices. So painful procedures such as tail docking, castration, and bead trimming. That was in the UK. A few years later, Peter Singer from the US coined the term speciesism, which really was a heavier focus on a holistic view of animal rights and how keeping animals for our use is speciesism. So it was more of a focus on the morality of raising animals for food than Animal Machines was in Peter Singer's Animal Liberation. So that's really when animal husbandry methods were questioned and animal rights came around more into the media. Moving into the 1990s, really technological innovation has boosted the sustainability of ag even more. I love the automated milkers where dairy cows can walk in and milk themselves and walk out. It's a win for welfare because they choose when they're milked. And then of course we have our controllers that call farmers at 3 a.m. when our temperature range is outside of the 5 degrees, but there's all sorts of sensors in the feed and the water lines, temperature, humidity, all sorts of things for maintaining our animals more efficiency with less labor. But times have changed and so have perceptions. I like to show this slide to students because eventually there's not, I think every student has seen a corded phone or used one, but eventually I think that might go away. Landlines are no more. So I like showing this comic about how phone ancestors had tails. But really, in terms of animals, the line between how people see pets versus all animals has changed. A century ago, animals weren't even allowed in the house if they were a pet, and now our pets are inside. They're considered a part of the family. The term fur babies are used, and that's starting to be a gray line with farm animals as well. You can see that people, especially during COVID, have a lot of their own backyard chickens. And there's costumes for them, and you can see that there's even some farm animals in with dogs and cats and other domestic animals inside the house. So this is what people think of or see when they think about animals, because they're so far removed from agriculture. So people think about their pets and how they're raised, and they really care about animals more that they consume for food. So in the past, the systems were extensive, meaning that there was a lot of cost and labor involved in producing the eggs or the meat or milk from animals, and it intensified in the past. But the perception now is that we need to go back to these extensive systems that are not economically sustainable for the agricultural industry. And why is that? Other than the pet boom, the average consumer, there's less than 2% of Americans that are actually employed in agriculture, so very few people in our population work in agriculture, but also the average consumer is 4 to 5 generations removed from the farm. So people only see food in the grocery store, and that link between the animal and the grocery store is often missing. So that's a little bit of the history and the milestones into how animal welfare or has come into society. But what is animal welfare actually? There's a big difference between animal welfare and animal rights, and oftentimes people aren't quite sure what the distinction is. So as an animal welfare scientist or an ethologist that studies animal behavior to see how an animal is coping with their environment, that is the definition of animal welfare. We'll use the term animal husbandry a lot in agriculture because that's how we care for animals. But from a scientific perspective, animal welfare is how the animal is coping with their environment. So it's the role for animal welfare scientists to find ways to measure how an animal is coping with their environment under different environments that we provide for them, but it's still how that animal is coping. And it's quite different for different animals, right? Chihuahua has different needs than a Great Dane, but they're both dogs. Same with broilers and laying hens. So the goal of animal welfare science is to see how the animal is perceiving their environment first, and then reacting to it internally and behaviorally. So the big distinction between animal rights versus animal welfare is that animal rights is the system of ethical beliefs that animals should have the same rights as humans. Extreme animal rightsists will say that we shouldn't even have pets because it's not their place. They should live their own life freely. So a lot of animal rights organizations do not believe animals should be used for anything, but for agriculture, certainly not for human consumption. On the other side, animal welfare or well-being, welfare and well-being are pretty synonymous. I have a picture of Temple Grandin there because she's really revolutionized, especially cattle and swine slaughter facilities, because she is autistic, so she sees the world a little differently than most people, and can, I think, see the perspective of the animal a little better. She would, back in the day, she would ride in the trucks with the cows and the pigs just to see what their experience are. So very basic things like shadows in the line of sight could stop an animal from moving. Very basic things that we wouldn't think about from our perspective. So again, animal welfare is the quality of life as perceived by the animal. And there's a couple of foundations that we use to approach how we can measure or evaluate animal welfare. And we have the 3 circles. So looking at natural living, so how would the animals live naturally. When we talk about incubation, there was the red jungle fowl with her clutch, and she sat on them and incubated them and moved them around to turn them. That's the natural living. Basic health and biological functioning, heart rate, health status, respiratory rate, things that we can measure in the blood, that's biological functioning. And then affective state is the tough one because that's the mental state, or what's going on in the brain, or how the different systems are interacting in the multifactorial processes going on that result in the same behavior or physiological response. So that's the 3 circles. And moving to the 5 freedoms, this was coined by the Bramble Committee in Europe in the 60s and 70s. And really these are freedom from hunger and thirst, discomfort, pain, injury, disease, the freedom to express normal behavior, and the freedom from fear and distress. And this is the foundation for animal welfare assurance and auditing. And some are a little easier to confirm than others. I'd also like to point out that in the field of animal welfare, we're trying to move on from just stopping negative things, from making sure that negative things aren't happening, to going into positive indicators of animal welfare, which is even harder because there's a lot of individual variation. So freedom from hunger and thirst can be a little easier to assure than perhaps freedom to express normal behavior. Again, think about the Chihuahua versus the Great Dane, or a Chihuahua in one country versus a Chihuahua in another country. The environment's quite different. And I like to show this picture mostly because I took the one of the chicken on the beach in Kauai. If you ever go to Hawaii, you should go to Kauai because there's a lot of chickens there. But people will go there and see a chicken near a boogie board on a beach and say, man, that is natural living for a chicken. And then you look at the chickens in the pole barn, the broilers in the barn, and there's a lot of them and it's dimmer. But the reality is that if you took one of those broiler chickens and put them on a beach, they wouldn't last very long. Our agricultural animals have been genetically selected for their environment, so thriving and natural behavior don't always directly link. So you can never fully separate the science from the ethics of animal welfare, simply because animal welfare is an ethical, it's a decision based on ethics, and ethics vary by culture, certainly, by country, governance, all sorts of factors that affect the ethics of a body of people. So it's moral principles held by people. Back in the day, Aristotle even talked about it. We've been talking about ethics forever. And it's really what is morally or ethically right or wrong. So certainly there's a difference between Europe's stance on animal welfare versus the US, but really decisions should be justified based on what's in the surrounding environment or climate. So how do we assure animal welfare generally? Well, legislature, there's laws. So at the federal and state level in the US, and then guidelines that are documents put out by producer organizations. So United Egg Producers for laying hens, NTF, National Turkey Federation for turkeys, and National Chicken Council for broilers, all have guidelines for animal welfare. And then certification programs are labeling systems that have a set of guidelines where there's a label on the product. Whole Foods has Global Animal Partnership, where there's a range of different steps where how that animal was raised is reflected by a label on the product from the animal. So there's all sorts of European legislature, which I'm not going to go into, but in the US, at least, in terms of farm animals, there's only 2 federal laws. One is the 28-hour law, which is related to transportation. And the other is the Humane Methods of Slaughter Act, which poultry are exempt from. But really, those are the 2 laws. So there's no laws that regulate the husbandry of livestock or poultry in the US as there is in Europe, but there are state laws. And I just want to use an example here. It's very interesting in the climate in the US how Proposition 12 in California was a ballot initiative, which means that the people put it forth for a vote and it passed. So that is a culture that's happening in the US. And I have this figure of the states that are cage free. It's not just California, but also the projection of how much cage free is going to be coming around. And I think about the quarter of the US laying hen population is cage free right now. But there needs to be more for the commitments that companies have made and pledged to go cage free. So very interesting time for laying hens. Just related to hatcheries in terms of hot topics that are going on, I think that the big one is the banning of culling male layer chicks after they hatch. So really the point is that Germany and France have passed legislature that the chicks have to be disposed of as embryos before they hatch. And so in ovo sexing technologies have really erupted, and they can sex the embryo somewhere around 13 days of age embryonically. So that's something that's going on in Europe. And moving on to automation in the hatchery, I just want to mention that, of all our sectors in poultry production, the hatchery is the most automated. There's belts and all sorts of machinery that handle chicks. And I just have a picture of the old school incubators in Egypt where there were mounds and eggs are put into these little ovens that were built, and there's still some around today. But going from that into our computer controlled, temperature controlled, completely secured environment for our eggs that are we've really come a long way. So there's a lot of automation in the hatchery, and I think with all that technology in place, there's a lot of opportunities for looking to see at ways that we can affect the environment of developing embryos. So going into the basics, we talk about the big four with incubation. A lot of the webinars in the past have temperature, humidity, ventilation, and turning. And there's all sorts of measures that the computer controller can give. There's a webinar on looking at all the data. Yes, for troubleshooting issues and for production, but also I think there's some opportunities for welfare as well, seeing if different modifications can affect welfare. So I'm going to talk a little bit about a study that we ran recently in my lab looking at hatching humidity. There's been a lot of work on, in terms of these four here, on temperature and humidity and ventilation, not so much turning because it's pretty automated and consistent, but there hasn't been a ton on humidity. And we ran a study looking at 3 different humidity settings, starting on embryonic day 18 with a control of 65% relative humidity from embryonic day 18 up till hatch, high 80% and low 55%. And you can see, I think this is the pointer. Where's that, the pointer? Laser pointer. You can see that we didn't quite hit the targets that we were looking for with our humidities, and that certainly affected our temperatures. So we aimed for 65 relative humidity. We actually got 62.8. Our 80% humidity was close at 79, but our low humidity, I think probably because the temperature was so high, we went a little low. So that balance, we got pretty close with our low being a little bit off, but our peak hatch, we pulled hatches, or we assessed the chicks that had fully hatched, starting at our, I think 474, and our peak hatch was at our 484, and at peak hatch 71% of the controls had hatched, 59% of the high humidity hatched, and 67% of the low humidity had hatched at that point. We assessed chick quality, and I'd like to mention that we have a lot of chick quality measures, which really these are indicators of welfare. We look at foot pad dermatitis for broilers, and we're looking at swollen hocks or hawk burn on the farm or swollen hocks in the incubator. So these are indicators of welfare. So we looked at body weights, feathering, the navel issues and leg issues. And so this figure here is a figure of feather, navel, and leg issues on the chicks that hatched at every 4-hour hatch window. So the green line there is the control. So based on the chick quality of the controls, we can see that, not surprisingly, chicks in the high humidity were more wet, and the chicks from the low humidity were more dry in terms of their feathers. No difference in navel issues or of feathering, but there were increased incidents of red hocks or swollen veins in both the high and low humidity treatments compared to the control. And we did raise these birds out and collected body weights every week. And you can see there was no difference in body weights between the treatments, and we actually had pretty low body weights, and so our chicks were pretty light in this study, or our birds were pretty light in this study. But something I'd really like to highlight from this project is we did a behavior test called the isolation test on day 20 of age. It's a really simple behavior test you can do, where you put a bird in a bucket for 3 minutes and record the vocalizations. You can look at defecations, which is a fear response, and attempts to escape. So the isolation test is a fear test. It can be used with a lot of our farm animals because all of them are flock or herd animals, so they don't like being isolated. And we can measure these frequencies of behaviors. And this first figure here are the number of vocalizations, which there was no difference in. But I think what's most interesting from this project is these attempts to escape the bucket. So it's simply the bird jumping on the rim, as you can see in the picture here, or out of the bucket. And I think what's really interesting is we found that with increasing humidity, there was less of a success for the bird to actually escape the bucket. So we also collected some leg bones, which in my lab we've measured morphology of the tibia bone or the tibiotarsus bone in terms of length, width, angulation of the proximal head, and the depths of the notches. And this could be related to the leg health or the strength that the birds had to actually jump out of that bucket. When humidity is really high, it's harder for those chicks to pip, and they have to use their legs to hatch fully. And so potentially that high humidity could have affected skeletal integrity in the legs, but that's to be determined. We're still working on that. So that was just a little bit of work that we've looked into. Definitely going to be more. Invite me back in 5 or so years. I'll have a lot more different things we've looked at in the incubation environment. But just going into the basics of the incubation community, the incubation environment, there's all sorts of things that we can control in the hatchery, but certainly we can't control anything before the eggs arrive in terms of troubleshooting. So the age, nutrition, the diet formulation, uniformity, health status, and fertility of breeders certainly affects the chicks' opportunities to grow and thrive and be optimized. Egg handling and storage and transport is a big area. Thankfully, we have nice temperature controlled transport trucks. And then, of course, there's all sorts of factors that I'm learning can affect incubation: weather, altitude, location, outside of not only outside of the incubators, but the controlling the environment inside, which all have to be factored together. That's what I'm saying. The data is very helpful for fine-tuning precision. But ultimately, at the end of the day, if there's stress breeders, then the likelihood of the chicks to thrive is going to be less. If those embryos are stressed in the incubator environment, that's going to decrease our performance. and they're off to a bad start. That affects our 7-day performance as well as mortality, and that compromises productivity. But I'd just like to mention there's an area that some researchers in the field of animal welfare are looking at with poultry, and that's early life programming. So things that we could do in the environment that's a short stressor that isn't a chronic stressor that could potentially improve performance just with a little bit of stress. So I have this figure here showing that we need a stress response to survive. We would die if we didn't have our stress hormone circulating to give us that adaptation energy to overcome a challenge. So sometimes short challenges can actually be good stress, but if it's chronic, then that turns into distress. And that's this early life programming concept. Advance my slide. So what can we do in the incubator environment? I have some pictures here where we've looked at different lighting in the incubator. It's a project we just ended, but looking if that affects the fear response and production of broiler chicks. But also there's sounds. Chicks synchronize their vocalizations before they even hatch, and that can affect uniformity of hatch and growth, certainly with our growth hormone circulating. So this embryonic programming might be a potential to unlock some welfare and performance and economic benefits for companies. So one example is temperature, looking at that embryonic heat production that it increases over time, more with broilers than layers. Are there certain time windows where we can alter that temperature a little bit for the birds to be perhaps more resilient to heat stress in a global warming environment? And then the humidity that I mentioned with our previous study, looking at leg health and how those chicks can hatch and thrive. And a little bit of a sustainability point here at the end, because it seems animal welfare is really grouped with sustainability. And I've spent a lot of time looking into how they're related. And we have the 3 pillars of sustainability. A lot of people talk about ESG, which is environmental, social, and governance. It's not exactly the same as sustainability, but sustainable companies have to be sustainable in a lot of ways. And the pure definition of sustainability is to maintain a certain rate or level, but certainly we want to increase that rate or level economically, but we have to balance that with the social and environmental pillars of sustainability, which animal welfare is in that social realm. So it's important to the public now, and sustainable animal production companies are going to adopt practices and facilities that are acceptable to the public. So we talked about a couple of examples, and I just want to mention that sustainable agriculture really does have to bring in pieces where we can try to keep the sustainability of the animal welfare up with all of the other pillars of sustainability. And that's pretty much my spiel for today. I just want to end my talk with a quote that I just really like by Yogi Berra. He had a lot of quirky quotes from the New York Yankees, but my favorite is, you can observe a lot just by watching. This is a point for management and the birds. Of course, I like watching bird behavior, but we can't improve on things that we don't see or record. So paying attention to the birds and just looking at how they react to their environment, I think can really help how we manage them. And that is the end of my talk. Yeah, please contact me if you have any questions. My email's there. Happy to talk to you.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I like that last quote. You can learn a lot by watching. That's one thing I like to do, especially when I was working more in the breeder side, is get to a breeder house and just sit down on the slats. Sit there for a while and don't do anything, don't move around, just watch and see what happens. You can learn a lot. I know at one time it seemed like in the industry, and this was years ago, the thoughts of animal welfare, people coming in telling people what to do, was always kind of scary. I mean, is the industry accepting that more as just a necessity, or are they fully embracing the concepts of animal? I know there's varying degrees of it. Some of it makes total sense and some of it marginal, but I mean, what are your thoughts on it?
I think that it's here to stay. I think that it's all consumers and customers that are driving these initiatives, and not always are they the right thing. I talk about cage free, where cage free really took off and we didn't quite have the facilities ready, so there was a lot of money and kind of rushed things going into it. I think that in terms of companies' sustainability, that animal welfare is part of investor decisions now. So how a company responds to animal rights requests or consumer requests, whatever it is, they have to respond in some way. And I'm just hoping that they work with people like me so they know what actually is good for the animal and sustainable, because there are some cases where at least in the early days of cage-free facilities, there were way more keel bone fractures with the birds, and there are certain breeds that aren't quite right for cage-free. So the welfare wasn't actually better for the birds when that was the whole premise of the push in the first place. So there's sometimes this disconnect between what the public perceives as good animal welfare versus what actually is good for the animal.
Right. Very, very different. We see that in a lot of areas in life. Like, really? Well, what about like in chicks? What are your opinion on day-old chicks? Like if you're providing them with music or lights or different noises and stuff, and some people try and do it for various reasons. What are your thoughts on that and how it affects the chicks?
I think I'm going to research it in different ones. I really think that even before they hatch, playing maybe a mother hen call could synchronize the chicks to grow more similarly and hatch around the same time. And then uniformity after hatch could be improved as well. There's in terms of what we can do different in the hatchery at day of hatch, there's just so much going on so fast. We just need to make sure that our machinery is working right, that our belt speeds are good, that our drop heights aren't too far, that we don't have any pinch points in our hatching baskets where toes can get caught and things like that, and that we're picking up loose chicks from the floor. So I think that the basics after they hatch are really the most important to focus on.
Okay, well, good. When you were talking about the in ovo sexing, it's something that I've followed for a long time, and it's been tried for years and years, and it was always like, well, this is just, it's not economical. But now you've got so many different agencies pushing it, the advances are moving forward quicker than they were before. Do you see a time when it becomes an actual economical thing where it doesn't have to be offset by government agendas to do that? I mean, because it is an expensive.
Any of the machinery?
Was that?
Have you seen any of the machinery in your international travels? You have?
Yeah.
I haven't.
It's quite massive and extensive.
I was just gonna say, so if you're doing that at day 13, what do? You have to move them out of the incubator and run through the machine.
It's quite a process.
Yeah, so that's extensive again. And if you as an animal welfare scientist who's done euthanasia work, the reality is that the maceration can be a quick and painless death if done right. So euthanizing the embryo before it hatches versus when it does, that I think that's more of a public perception thing. And it's my understanding that the best technology out there right now is pretty much feather sexing in ovo.
Yeah. And then it's like what to do with the other ones, but
yeah.
But no,
so
it's something that's coming. It's something that's coming. I just curious when it can be run by people without a subsidy of some sort, because right now I think that's where it's at, but I'm not opposed to it. It's just
where did the hatchery waste go? All that.
What is the effects of automation on welfare, or increased automation? There's always like this process more and more and more. I mean, do you see any effects on that, or acceptance or not of that?
It's interesting with society and technology, it's incorporated into our lives. We have a computer on us at all times now, right? And I think that hatcheries are pretty much as automated as they can get now. It's the most automated sector. I just, like I said, with taking some of the human handling out, you're potentially taking out some of the error due to humans, but also you need to keep up your PPMs on your equipment, make sure you're watching everything and monitoring. So I think that there can be some potential issues, but as long as it's managed well and everything's checked, then I think that it's good welfare.
Mhm. Just as long as we monitor all those things, right? You talked at one time about some of that you and I have talked about using different lights and incubation and stuff. I mean, is there anything you found as far as a color or spectrum of light, or is it still too early in the stages of research?
We just finished this project, but there's definitely been some research by others showing about the effect of red light on reproduction. So for laying hens, looking at reproduction, and then that green and blue light can reduce fearfulness and stress later in life. And also just having a white light can speed up development and hatch early, which we just talked about before we started this, that potentially having chicks hatch earlier isn't the best for their welfare because they aren't fully developed yet, right?
Mhm. What about the impact of the cage free? You talked about the different states moving that way, and I know some consumers have demanded we all want only cage free stuff now. What is the impact of that on food safety as far as the product? I mean, are we seeing anything like we're getting a better quality product as far as food safety or not?
Well, I know it's more expensive. Well, I'm not sure if there's actually been any research on like salmonella in eggs from hens in cages versus not. I'm not actually sure if there's any difference in food safety. I know there's more floor eggs.
Yeah. Well, and that's an issue right there. I was just going to say, I know there's more floor eggs, and eggs are in a cage system, they roll out from under the hens. In a cage free, there can be more feces on them and more floor eggs and more shell contaminants. And so, of course they're washed after that. But yeah, that I think we do know now. As far as it goes past that, I'm sure from a food safety standpoint, they're all checked or whatever. But I do know, like you said, there are more floor eggs, and therefore you've got some more contaminants on the shells. Okay. How long do you think is sufficient for chicks to be held at the hatchery before they're shipped? Most places will ship them out within a few hours. There's some that, for one reason or another, have to be held overnight and shipped the next day. What are your thoughts on that? And we do know our primary breeders ship them a couple of days. Sometimes they're in shipment.
Yeah, so it's you know better than I do what's standard for the hatchery, 24, 36-ish hours. And the chicks, I mean, they have a residual yolk sac that they can survive on for 3 days. We have chicks that are shipped too, and they can survive off of that and thrive. So in terms of optimal time, I mean, you have to pull hatch once, right? So you pull them when most of them have, and they are fine without any additional supplements for 24 to 48 hours.
And that is the way the hen is, the chick is designed. If you see them sitting in a nest, the hen's gonna sit there and wait till all of them hatch. And so they are capable of utilizing their yolk nutrients, and they get the maternal antibodies and everything from it. So yeah.
They're precocial species.
What is just, I know you're not necessarily an incubationist, but if from what you see from the outside, what is one of the important variables that you would really take into account in the incubation process that you think there's room for improvement or something we really need to watch more of?
Incubation basics haven't changed in a long time with I think we figured out turning. I think it's that delicate balance between temperature and humidity. Like I said, your location, whether it rained that day or not, all can affect the machine's ability to maintain those levels. And as we spoke about before, we alter all of our controller settings to maintain a certain eggshell temperature, right? So I think that so I'm looking into manipulations. I looked at humidity, but I'm also looking at temperature to see if we could increase the temperature a little bit during incubation for a short period of time to make birds more resilient to heat stress later in life. So again, that little early life programming, I think there's some small environmental alterations that we can do in the incubation environment to program birds to be to optimize their performance later. I mean, in terms of broilers, if they're processed at 6 weeks, then in total, a third of their life is spent in the incubator, right? So I think that there's a window of opportunity where we can look at some sort of environmental manipulations, or even maybe supplements that we can put on eggs to improve welfare and performance of the embryos.
Okay, you can put on your little futuristic fortune teller hat now. So yeah, you've got one there somewhere. So you talked about the direction from an extensive system, an intensive, and going back extensive. Where do you think we're headed with that? I mean, where do you think, I mean, is this common sense going to abound at some point to where we're back to what's economical and a way to try and feed a world that's, in need of food resources?
I think that food security will balance things out. I think that a lot of the products that are sold from animals in extensive systems is a niche market for people that can't afford it, where most of the people in the world cannot. So I don't want to use the phrase first world problems, but if we want to provide global food security for high quality protein from animals, then we're going to have to balance out production. There has to be a gain in production. And I think that there are some wins for welfare and economics and production and for society.
Yeah. That little chart you put up, the 3-way, is like, okay, we got to find a place that
it's a tough time.
Yeah. So do you think, and again, looking into the future again, I know in hatcheries at one time we used to debeak, and then we did beak trimming, and then we did beak conditioning, which is essentially the same process, not same process, but the same result. Do you think is there people like looking into that to try and get rid of, removing some of the toes, beak conditioning, those like that?
Definitely.
There's a push right now for that to.
Yeah, well, any of those physical alterations that we do to any animal is to help them essentially later down the road, or prevent a problem that could happen. So in the terms of the toe trimming, that's for a lot of times breeders during mating, so the males don't hurt the females, right? And with beak treatment, that is for cannibalism, which is a slippery slope. Chickens investigate their environment with their beak, and then they investigate their buddy with their beak, and then something happens, and with that pecking order, cannibalism is pretty much impossible to stop once it has started. And I know that breeders right now are having a hard time with feather licking, which can turn into aggressive feather pecking and cannibalism. And it might not always happen in every flock, but when it does, the economic deficit is huge for those birds, and not to mention the welfare.
Yeah. And the economics is the big thing, but welfare is as well. Have you dealt with, and I don't know, I mean, I know you've done some international travel, but I did quite a bit of international travel. In some places, they just don't get it. I mean, very simple things. I mean, how would you recommend? I mean, is it just simply just explaining and educating of why we need to? Because some just don't know. They don't care. They're doing things the fastest way. So I don't know what you got recommendations on that.
Well, that's the culture part, it's a trickle down effect from the top down. So it has to be a culture of care, and it has to be a culture of making sure that things are done right. And yeah, I like to say that we treat animals better in the US than some countries treat their people. So if you're trying to talk to them about using the same tone in the US versus another country where it's third world and there's so much poverty, they might not understand all these special things you need to do for animals when people are struggling. So I think that it is really about the basics, making sure that you're watching, but it's attention. A lot of in these higher welfare systems that are more extensive, it takes more management. There's opportunities for higher welfare, but if it's not managed well, then those birds could be doing way worse than any commercial basic system. So it really comes down to people at the end of the day.
Like you had mentioned at one time when they said, let's bring them into pens so they're not out in the elements or inside, we can control the environment and all this. And now it seems like there's the push, well, let's throw them back outside again where they're have contact with wild birds flying through and whatever they're carrying, and dramatic changes in weather and other pests. So yeah, there's a balance in there for sure. Okay, here's a good one for you as an animal welfare person. What are some key indicators that you would see in the hatchery that chicks might be distressed?
Well, definitely vocalizations. You can hear them definitely if they're not doing well. You can look at their yes, their thermoregulatory behavior. Are they huddling or not? Are they spaced out? Their activity, looking at how active they are. You can look at their eyes. What is it? You want them to be bright, open fully, and not drooping. You can look at their feather cover. As I mentioned, I guess I didn't have any pictures, but the red hawks is usually a sign of dehydration or protruding veins. And the healing of the navel, you can look at other webinars for troubleshooting that stuff, but those are all indicators of welfare, but also just making sure that there's no injuries. Pinch points are a big one for toes when they're moving around so fast. So making sure that there's no blood spots on any of the baskets that would indicate that chicks are getting caught somewhere.
Mm-hmm. Okay, there's a few other questions on here that are a little bit more specific, so we might have you answer those directly, or we will as well. So we'll share those with you. But thank you very much. Very good presentation, informative. I learned a lot of stuff and had a lot of good comments and discussion, stimulated a lot of discussion here. So, but it's an important topic that we all have to deal with, whether we really want to or not. It's here. So.
Mm-hmm. Well,
thank you for your work. Thank you for your work, and hopefully we can do some work together.
Yeah, please. I'd love that.
And thank you all for attending our webinar again. Everybody will get a link in the next day or two, an email with a link to this video of this presentation, as well as a PDF of Shawna's presentation as well, so you can take and review it. And I know a lot of people watch these after the fact. So anyway, thank you, Shawna, and thank you all for attending. We look forward to seeing you all as maybe we can as our next webinar series next month. Thank you.
Thanks.